Hey y'all, my name is Will. I competed with PDB for a year, and today we're going to go over the LOC K lecture. So today we're going to go over the fundamentals of the K, right? Specifically, and from the perspective of the negative, and more specifically, the structure of the LOCK, with also an overview for how we should grasp the substance that we advance within the LOCK. For clarity, we will not cover the fundamentals of a KF, as that is covered by Hunter in another video. Shout out to Hunter for that. But although we would recommend watching this video prior to theirs on the KF, because I think it might help contextualize a couple of things. So now, without further ado, let's move on into talking about the structure of an LOCK. But before we kind of get into that, I do also want to kind of outline what we'll be going over. So you'll notice that in each section, there will be two parts. For instance, framework will have a substantive explanation, followed by some technical ones to help synthesize a useful understanding for each argument going into a round that you're reading the K in. For clarity, a lot of these examples I'll include are on CAP, since that is something I feel the most comfortable with, and Lila and I's lecture on the CAP K will probably clarify a lot of these terms if you're at all confused. But if that's still not clear to you, feel free to reach out. We're more than happy to help you. Given that, let's start off with framework. The first part of the LOCK is the framework. Along with the thesis argument in the context of your K substance, the framework is where you read paradigmatic framing arguments. In other words, the framework is where you write and thus read 1. Arguments that outline the foundational basis of your K, i.e. how it grasps the world, and 2. Arguments that, from that basis, frame how the judge should evaluate the round and the arguments within it. To give an example, if you're reading a K that advocates for the principally malice line on women's emancipation, you could include arguments in your framework for why private property is the root of women's oppression, and how the only proletarian line that can guide the emancipation is through Marxism, thus Maoism, and thus lead to the emancipation of the oppressed masses who are women. Although every argument should be constructed with the intention of being able to go for it as a win condition for the negative, we should also apply that to, when we're constructing the K, right? Or how we conceptualize the K on the negative. If you remember our previous example, if you include arguments about why private property establishes patriarchy, then you would want to leverage that argument to, quote, frame out the affirmative. In other words, if you're correct about how patriarchy functions, and that the judge should evaluate the round in a way that emphasizes the K, then the F is not much of a concern to you. I think there are plenty of ways to use this sort of claim, right? So for example, one way to use these arguments is to say that the judge should evaluate the K first. That alone doesn't mean a whole lot though, right? Think of it like this instead. Think of it like impact calculus with a advantage versus disadvantage debate. If the F is winning, that probability comes first, then that means climate change on advantage 1 outweighs. And there's not much a negative can do now with their economy disad, right? So without also, they can't really do much with it without also winning, weighing, and framing as to why I should evaluate to the contrary. Now, you get to tell me how this frames out offense on other parts of the debate that are predicated on the AF solving for an advantage or, predicated on the AF winning their solvency block. I think an example of this is, for example, a lot of teams will read link turns to your criticism. They might try and say, well, as a result of the affirmative plan, we're in the general direction of socialism because we socialize medicine or XYZ thing. I don't know, something that is good for the climate or something, right? However, that's predicated on evaluating the solvency of the affirmative. But remember, you're already winning reasons why that just leads to monopoly capitalist control and thus patriarchal control over the oppressed masses who are women, right? The implication is that if you're winning that framing claim, in some sense, that also takes out the links because the link turns because the link turn is predicated on them winning their affirmative. Keep that in mind. Let's move on to the links. So the most important part of the K is probably the links. In the context of the LOCK, the links are where you generate offense against the 1AC. In other words, as the first place of generating link uniqueness to your K, it's where you justify how and why the 1AC advances, defends, and intensifies what your K is criticizing. For example, let's say the 1AC defends a plan text about increasing U.S. foreign direct investment to Brazil, and you're reading a K which advances the principally malice line on national liberation. You could read links about how the 1AC just maintains U.S. monopoly capitalists and thus imperialist enslavement of Brazil, and only funds the Brazilian bureaucratic capitalists or big landlords, and thus is counter-revolutionary in the ongoing war against the Communist Party of Brazil's Red faction. So, what about the more technical part of writing the link? Well, let's go to that and think about the technical construction and the strategic uses of the Ks, or in this case, the links. I think every K-link should be formatted in a particular way to be the most strategic. Of course, you can have fun with this and how you choose to do this, but I think, nonetheless, the kind of thesis of what we'll be talking about here should be incorporated to the way you can make your links. So, subpoint 1, let's say your first link, should just be a tag. For example, the AF increases foreign investment. In practice, or in a round, this might look like, go to the links. The first link is that the AF increases foreign investment. Okay, cool. But again, that doesn't really mean a whole lot in a vacuum. So, subpoint A under here should start elaborating on that, right? You want to give the judge the kind of thesis of what they're looking for or what they're listening to, so that way when you're going over the links at probably blazing speeds, they're kind of able to, well, I know what the thesis of this link is, and so I'm listening in for the warrants now. So, subpoint A under the sort of tag, if you will, should explain why exactly it is the case that the AF increases foreign investment. Think of it as an internal link scenario that you would read on advantage or disadvantage. What happens after the passing of the affirmative that then triggers that investment? What do these investments look like? How do they end up contributing to monopoly capitalism? These are all questions I think need to be answered or explained and elaborated on to establish the substantive reason why they link into your criticism. It's not enough to just say they increase investment, move on, right? Because I think that relies on the judge kind of knowing why that is the case, right? Which is not going to be great, one, I think, for pedagogical practices, and two, for strategic purposes. Because if they don't know what your K is critiquing, right? Or if they don't understand what the thesis of the links are, then how are they supposed to evaluate any sort of link offense, right? So then, subpoint B then should explain why this turns the affirmative. I think this is an underutilized part of the link debate because assuming you're winning link uniqueness, I don't think you need the framework in order to win the debate. If you think the AF comes first, we have already internal link turned the affirmative, vice versa links. For example, let's pretend that the AF is reading a climate change advantage and they win framing for why I should evaluate the affirmative first. Okay, cool. This doesn't magically undo the links because it functions on the layer of the affirmative. In a world where we are winning a link that substantively explains that because of monopoly capitalism and because of the fact that they increase monopoly capitalism through their foreign investments they justify, etc., then they're going to increase rates of deforestation and overconsumption, right? This means that you could also use this as a takeout to the perm to substantially explain that the links trigger the undesirable impacts, which the perm inevitably includes part of the affirmative, right? Which means that the links still trigger that impact and thus a reason why to reject the perm. But all this to say that the link should be written in a way that has embedded offense against the affirmative, where it doesn't matter if the AF wins their framing because the links, remember, turn the AF. So if they turn the AF because of its shoddy implementation, then why does winning that the AF come first magically get rid of that, right? Cool. Getting to the next section, we got to talk about the impacts. If you're familiar with 1AC advantages or 1NC DAs, the impact section of the K will probably make the most immediate sense. Just like you would with an advantage or a disadvantage, the impact section of the LOC is where you're reading terminal impacts of your K. In other words, why is your K, why is it what your K is criticizing, continuing, and thus the 1AC advancing, defending, / intensifying such as bad? I think a more simple way of imagining this is, okay, you're winning that we're critiquing capitalism because of the framework and the links. But what is the terminal impact that makes us care about capitalism so much? So for example, if you're reading a K that advances the principally malice lying on trans feminine oppression, you could read impacts about how proletarian trans femmes within the capitalist centers are exploited to a higher degree, or how peasant trans femmes in the colonies / semi-colonies are sold into sexual slavery, which are all indicating reasons why we should probably care about the political economy of monopoly capitalism and the things that it inevitably justifies. Cool. That also means that you get access to, like, weighing, Okay, yeah, you're capitalist, but here's why that's bad, right? Cool. So the final part of the K is the alternative. You may refer to this as the alt, or simply alternative. section of the K, and this is where you outline and justify what your K is defending in competition with the 1AC. In other words, what you are defending which solves for the links and thus the impacts of your K, or your K's offense against 1AC, and thus the second part in your K that generates link uniqueness for your K. It is best to ground yourself within the substance of your K in these instances, or when you're kind of thinking about these questions, and from what practice or otherwise that substance advances is necessary to solve for what you are criticizing, and defend and justify that as your alternative. So for example, if you're reading a K which advances the principally malice lying on new African national liberation within the US, your alternative could be self-determination for the new African nation in the Black Belt, through People's War to seize power led by the multinational and militarized Communist Party of the US under Maoist leadership. So that's kind of a way to kind of substantively think about your alternative, right? Is kind of answer these sort of, I guess, substantive questions about how to, resolve for why capitalism is bad in this instance, right? But unpacking the more technical explanation, I think every alternative should include a reason why you resolve the AF's impacts, because it indicates that the AF has no unique offense to claim and thus is not solved for by the K, which means why would I vote for the AF and risk the links? In other words, if climate change is what Advantage 1 is about, but the K solves for climate change without triggering the links, then I think I would just vote neg every time. Also, the alt should be clear on how it functions. This is where things get a little bit tricky. Does your alternative fiat an action like a plan or a counterplan would? In this case, an example would be like an MLM alt. Or do you endorse a model of debate that would be good? That might look like some projects that endorse, here's how we should engage in the debate space and, justifications for how we do that. Or do you endorse an ideological heuristic that is good? For example, an orientation towards, philosophical claims like ontology, right, more broadly, right? We're not concerned about how it is, being operationalized in the debate space, right? It doesn't defend that just magically voting neg means that, we suddenly do something or something immediately changes, right? We're defending a heuristic that if we had this orientation towards the world, that it would be good, right? So your alt solvency should answer one of these questions. Additionally, your alt should not be a minute of why someone did your alt and they were happy and it worked for them, right? Instead, you should explain why the alt is able to resolve for the substantive issues in your impacts and framework. Returning back to the cap K, why does the alt solve for cap? Why does the alt solve your impact of genocide? These are all questions that should be answered in your K and specifically the solvency part of your alternative. Cool. Now that we have briefly gone over the structure of an LOC-K, which hopefully answers some of your initial questions, we're now going to talk about more specifically about how we should be approaching the substance of a K, whether it be in the LOC or on the affirmative. First and foremost, it is important to grasp and thus engage in the constant process of studying the substance of your K. Or in other words, you should read and understand the history and practice of whatever you are defending. This is important for objective reasons, for example, to make sure that you are not defending fascism or any other reactionary nonsense, and to make sure that you are not defending whatever you are in an opportunist manner. For example, you can defend the correct line on something, but defend it in a way where, it's just an argument. Right? Or maybe defend in a way that warps the substance of what is actually supposed to be forwarded and instead forward something kind of incoherent. Secondary to that, it's also important for strategic reasons. It's important to enable you to write solid links against whatever 1AC you might hit, and to answer the line by line that the MG will read against your K, and to answer flex questions. If they go, what's People's War? And you don't know what People's War is, then what are you supposed to do, right? Not only does this perceptually look pretty bad, but this means you're not going to know how to answer whatever, monopoly capitalist propaganda offense that they're going to read against your alternative. I think one specific example of that is studying what you are defending in your K is key to actually defending it well is, for example, there are teams that will sometimes read framing about why action that is material precludes abstract orientations of the world for X, Y, or Z reasons. If that is the case, your alternative should not be about how your alternative is an abstract orientation towards a philosophical outlook, because then, as per your material action framework, those are all now reasons why we shouldn't evaluate your alternative. In the cap debate, for example, there's a famous historical materialism shell and, iterations of the cap shell that follow this trend that will read epistemology first framework about how we should interrogate our knowledge, but then read historical materialism or Marxism-Leninism as your alternative, which doesn't make sense because, for example, historical materialism understands that the trajectory of history is a result of contradictions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie that produces class struggle, which would seem to indicate the opposite of your epistemology framing, since practice and the contradictions that practice produces the base for capitalism and thus its superstructural influence to exist, in other words, the ideology of capitalism and the things that follow that. Simply reading the literature and maybe consulting your friends or coaches or other community members would reveal to how incoherent and thus unstrategic this is. Now, obviously, it's super daunting, so I think you should also approach this from the fact that you are not alone and that there is obviously a community that is aimed to help you with these sort of things. For example, why we're making this video. So you don't have to read all of everything because that would take forever, right? But maybe reach out to someone and ask, what are some of the first steps to kind of understanding this lit base, whether it be cap or anything else.